Welcome to Chapter 12. We are going to talk about information security management in this chapter. I'm going to give some background and some high-level information about information security management from my experience, and then I'm going to cover a few of the highlights from Chapter 12. So recent research shows that over 70% of organizations have been compromised by some type of successful cybersecurity attack in the past 12 months. 70%, that's a lot. And 62% of them are small businesses. So the thought now isn't necessarily, is a breach going to occur within my company? It's really when. And if you look at this in comparing big businesses to small businesses, for example, Target, who recently had a data breach, it cost them more than $100 million in 2014. But when you look at that loss compared to the company revenue, it's less than 0.1% of their sales for that year. So it was just a little blip in their radar. But when you look at that for a small business, it can be devastating. It can really, it can ruin a business. It can bring it to its knees. Plus, if you think about it, small businesses might be easier attack for hackers and people that are trying to gain access to security, because small businesses don't have the security measures in place that large businesses might. One thing that we have seen in the technology industry in recent years is a new position in the C-suite, and that is the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO. So we've heard of the CEO and the CIO and the COO. So this is the Chief Information Security Officer, that really their ultimate responsibility is regarding cybersecurity and making sure that their company does not experience a breach. I do have a story I can share about a software company. A friend of mine works for a small software company, and they recently experienced a security breach. So this is a very, very small company. You wouldn't think it would be on the target for anybody. And the breach really wasn't about getting access to the data that that company holds, but it was a ransomware attack. And so their goal was really to get money out of the company. So essentially holding their systems hostage until the company paid money. And then once the company pays that money, then that hacker will then, typically it means they're going to release some kind of a code or a program that's then going to go and unlock their servers. So that's a very common type of attack, especially on smaller companies. I also have another story. Now this is one that I think this is maybe more of an urban myth than a real story, but I've heard it word of mouth many times, but I think it drives home a point. And that is, it's a story about an employee who outsourced his job to an offshore resource. So pretty creative, right? You don't want to do the work, and so you hire some offshore resource to do the work for you. You probably don't have to pay them very much. You're still making a profit. So anyway, once they found out about it, the employee was fired, but and this is the part of it that I think might be an urban myth, and that is, the story goes that the reason they were fired wasn't because they had hired someone else to do their job. It was because the person was in another country. They were actually in China, and they didn't have the right security authorization to access the data that this employee was supposed to be accessing. So the company was more worried about the security than what the employee had actually done. And the reason that the company noticed this or even found out about it, I mean, the person might have been detected eventually, but the information security team detected unusual activity between the employee's workstation and China. which looked very odd, and so that's how they ended up tracking it down. But anyway, I think the point of the story is just how important security is in today's world. So, you know, if you've not been through security training or had to sign different types of security documents with your company, I'd probably be surprised, because most companies are doing that now. All right, so let's jump into Chapter 12. So what is the goal of information system security? Well, it's really, there's 4 areas. There's threats, there's vulnerabilities, there's safeguards, and there's targets. So a threat is a person or organization that wants to obtain data or other assets illegally, so without permission and without anyone else's knowledge. That's the first one. The second one is vulnerability, and that is the opportunity for threats to gain access to your organization's data or assets. For example, when you buy online and you provide your credit card data, the data is transmitted over the internet, and so that is vulnerable to threats. And then the next one is safeguards. Safeguards is when the organization takes steps to block threats from happening, to block threats and vulnerabilities. And then target is the last one, and that is the actual asset that's desired. So that's what they're trying to get to, whether it's money, whether it's data, you know, maybe something else. So what are the sources of threats? So you'll see 5 different sources here. We have unauthorized data disclosure, incorrect data modification, a faulty service, a denial of service, and loss of infrastructure. So those are the different types of losses that can happen, and then you'll see that the threats actually fall into 3 different categories. There's the human error, there's the actual computer crime, and then there's national disasters that can happen as well. I guess a couple things I would like to point out here when we talk about denial of service. So what does that mean? That might be something you haven't heard of before. So essentially it's when a human inadvertently shuts down some type of computer, web service, corporate router, something, by starting another application that's very intensive. So in other words, they start some other application that essentially takes up so much resources and power that it denies access to some other part of the system. And then you'll also hear denial of service attacks, and so those are another form of denial of service, and that's essentially when a hacker intentionally floods a web server with millions of bogus requests, so essentially eating up all the resources. So similar to the other one where the user unintentionally shuts it down, but this one is an attack that basically does the same thing. The other thing that I wanted to outline here is on the faulty service, this term usurpation. And essentially that occurs when a hacker invades the computer system and they replace a legitimate program in that computer system with their own program that's obviously unauthorized, and then it shuts down other applications. So they're running another application in place of a legitimate one that can do a variety of things. You know, maybe it's designed to turn servers off, maybe it's just designed to spy or steal or manipulate data, or maybe other things that it might mean to do. All right, so what are the types of security losses? There's some terms that I wanted to make sure that we define to make sure that you understood what those terms meant. Some of these you might have heard before: pretexting, phishing, spoofing. I wanted to go through and make sure that we define what each one of these terms mean. So pretexting is essentially when someone pretends to be someone they're not. So for example, you know, a telephone, somebody calls you on the telephone and pretends to be somebody and gets your credit card information. Phishing is essentially pretexting but doing it by email. So we've all heard of the phishing emails where you get this email and they want you to click on a link and you know that you think it's legit, it's really your bank or your credit card company or whatever else. And then there is also something called spoofing, and this is similar to pretexting, but it's using an IP address. So IP, Internet Protocol type address, and so it uses that address to masquerade as another site. So essentially you think you're accessing a legitimate site, and you can do the same thing by email as well. Another thing on here, sniffers, which you may or may not have heard of before, but sniffing is essentially the ability to intercept computer communications. So drive-by sniffing actually means when you're on a wireless network. So you know when you're at Panera Bread Company and you get on their network and they give you the little warning message that says this is a public network. You know, someone could be sitting there in Panera or in the parking lot or somewhere nearby with one of these sniffing devices, and they can gain access to whatever you're doing over that network. So if you're going to be shopping online with your credit card, you probably don't want to be doing it on a public network. All right, so how should you respond to security threats? We've talked a little bit about passwords already in this class, so you know, you want to make sure that you are taking your passwords seriously. Be very careful when you're opening your email. Don't click on links that, you know, you don't know what they mean. Make sure that you're keeping your antivirus software updated. There's a whole list of items here that you can do. I'm not going to go through all of those, but my guess is probably the company that you work for is also talking about these kind of things now to make sure that their employees are doing these, to make sure that the company's not vulnerable. So when we talk about the 5 components of information systems, we talked about this in the first class. And so if you break this down into how organizations should respond to security threats, it's really broken into 3 categories. There's technical safeguards, and that's protecting the hardware and the software. That's probably what most people think of when they think of security, is the encryption and the firewalls and things like that to make sure they protect the computer systems. But there's also other things that need to happen to protect the data. So data safeguards, making sure you're encrypting passwords, making sure you're doing backup and recovery, making sure that people understand what data is proprietary, what needs to be protected. And then when it comes to the procedures and the people, these are the human safeguards. And this is the piece that really, I think in the last 2 to 5 years has really taken off. Companies have really started to become more conscious about how important the human safeguard is when they're protecting their data. All right, so what security policies, what should they stipulate? And again, my guess is a lot of you probably work for companies that have already done this. The company has sent you through training and they've explained to you what type of data is sensitive within the organization, how you need to be careful of that data. Is it okay to email that data? If you need to share that data outside the company, how will you do that? Can you do it on your phone? Can you do it on your laptop? Can you take this type of data home? Those types of things are security policies that companies are now putting in place. All right, so what are the technical safeguards against these types of threats? So we've talked about some of this already. Encryption, that's essentially encrypting your data. We're going to talk about some of this in more detail on the following slides. We'll talk about firewalls. We'll also talk about malware protection. So the first thing I want to talk about from a security standpoint is something called HTTPS. And this is really the most secure communication that can be used over the internet. It's a protocol, essentially. HTTPS is a protocol. And it is a data encryption that uses another protocol called Secure Sockets Layer, known as SSL. Sometimes you'll hear it called Transport Layer Security as well, which is TLS. But essentially what this is it's a combination of public key and private key and symmetric encryption. And it makes it safe for you to send credit card information because it is secure. So essentially what happens is your computer contains a public key of a website to which it's going to connect to. And then your computer generates a key that's going to be used for the symmetric encryption. Your computer then encodes the key using the website's public key and then sends the encrypted key to the website. The website then on the other side can decode the symmetric key using its private key. So it all sounds very complicated, but it's all laid out here on this slide. And essentially, once all that happens, then your computer and the website can communicate using symmetric encryption. So another thing that I wanted to point out is the concept of a firewall. My guess is a lot of you may have heard of that, that computers are protected using firewalls. It's essentially a computing device that can prevent unauthorized network access. And I would say almost all organizations, even small ones, probably have some type of firewall. In fact, typically they usually have multiple firewalls that protect their servers. So again, it's essentially a computing device. So it's a piece of hardware that can help protect a network. You may have also heard about malware protection. This is antivirus and anti-spyware programs. We're going to go on and go to the next slide because that's going to actually define these in a little bit more detail. Most of you that have a personal computer may have experienced this because your system gets slow. You start getting all these pop-up advertisements and just lots of weird things start happening on your computer. Typically those are some type of malware type program or spyware that has been, without your knowledge, loaded on your computer that's then running in the background. There's also other types of viruses, payloads, Trojan horses, worms, beacons, a lot of different types of things. But essentially they're all causing unwanted activity on your computer, and they can be as dangerous as deleting data or stealing data. I would say most of the time they turn out to be more of an annoyance than anything, and can literally bring your computer to its knees. So how can you protect against security threats? So I talked about the human safeguard and why the human safeguard is so important. There's a lot of things that humans can do, outside of having the HTTPS and the firewalls and all the virusware protection. There's a lot of things that people can do to make sure that their company is secure. So here's a list here. So the first one is really just talking about making sure that employees are trained and they understand what their responsibilities are and who's responsible for different things. Also in hiring and screening, you can run background checks and security checks on your new employees to make sure that they're good employees to hire and that they don't have a background that might be provide a security threat to your organization. Responsibility, accountability, and compliance, that's really just talking about security, making sure that people understand what their roles and responsibilities are. Termination, making sure that termination is friendly. You don't want to have an unfriendly termination and give someone a reason to, want to have some type of a security breach against your organization. So again, all of this are things that are human safeguards, things that can be taught to your employees to help protect them. All right, and then we also have account administration. I've talked a lot about passwords and password management already, so I'm going to kind of gloss over this. Hopefully everybody knows the importance of that. How should organizations respond to security incidents? Well, they should have a plan in place, and everyone should know what their role is, what their specific responses should be, and to even practice it. I know companies that actually have practiced disaster recovery days where they go through and practice what's going to happen if there was a national disaster, or what are they going to do even if there's a security breach. So again, if your company is not doing that now, my guess is it probably will be soon. Most companies are taking this very seriously, and also understanding that the employees in their company are a very important aspect of information security management.